started in the 60s, long before environmental laws, before the government, or the public, started asking hard questions about what companies were dumping into America's wetlands, especially the swamps surrounding Lake Okeechobee, Florida. Back then, chemical companies quietly disposed of things they didn't want anyone studying too closely. Industrial pesticides, contaminated solvents, and experimental compounds that had failed laboratory testing. The kind of chemicals that didn't belong anywhere near water or wildlife. But that didn't stop them. At night, trucks rolled down dirt roads that weren't on any maps. Headlights off, engines idling low. Men climbed out of the trucks and rolled steel barrels off the back into the swamp, one after another. Some of the drums burst open when they hit the water. Others slowly leaked into the marshlands and vegetation. Thick chemicals seeped into the mud and black water where frogs, fish, turtles, and alligators fed. At the time, nobody cared. The swamp was considered worthless land, no towns, no businesses, just miles of water, reeds, and mosquitoes. The only people who ever went out there were local hunters and frog giggers. So when a few of them started disappearing, no one asked many questions. But something in that poisoned water was changing. Something that had been breathing those chemicals for years, feeding on contaminated animals, growing, mutating. Then in 1970, something happened that finally forced people to pay attention. A young couple drove out to the lake late one summer night. A quiet place locals called Lover's Lane. Their car was parked near the water, windows down, music playing softly on the radio. They were supposed to be home before midnight, but they never came back. At first, people assumed they had run off together. Eloped, young love, small town rumors. But 3 days later, a hunter-out frog gigging along the marsh found something in the reeds. What was left of the car. The doors had been torn completely off, the roof crushed like it had been stepped on, and scattered in the mud nearby were pieces of what used to be the couple. The sheriff blamed it on a large alligator. That's what the official report said. But there was one problem with that explanation. Alligators don't crush cars, and they sure as hell don't rip the doors off them. Something else had come out of that swamp. At first, the reports sounded like drunken campfire stories. Hunters talked about seeing something moving through the reeds, something far too big to be an alligator. Frog hunters whispered about a shape rising out of the black water. A giant lizard, frog thing, hunched and towering nearly 10 feet tall. Some said it walked like a man. Others swore it moved with a slow, heavy crawl before standing upright when it reached the shoreline. But everyone agreed on one thing. The tracks it left behind were real. Footprints pressed deep into the mud, webbed and massive, as if something weighing nearly 1,000 pounds had climbed out of the swamp and started walking the land. Some people survived their encounters. They came back pale and shaking, their stories spilling out in broken sentences about huge black eyes, long arms, and a mouth filled with serrated teeth. But not everyone made it back. Others simply vanished. Boats drifted empty across the water. Trucks were found abandoned along dirt roads. Hunters went into the marsh and were never seen again. Before long, the quiet little communities around Lake Okeechobee began to change. People stopped sitting out on their porches at night. Doors stayed locked. Shotguns leaned beside every bed. Men carried rifles even when they went to the store or the bait shop. And when the swamp got quiet, when the frogs stopped croaking and the wind stopped moving through the reeds, nobody went outside. Because everyone knew something was moving out there in the something that was no longer afraid of humans, but ate them. The people around Lake Okeechobee would start calling it by a name. The gator frog beast.
Welcome back to Obsidian Quill Publishing. Nightmares, where the shadows have stories, and the dark always has teeth. If you enjoy cryptid horror, strange legends, and the kind of stories that make you double-check the shadows outside your window at night, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next nightmare. This channel grows and has grown because of you. Every subscription, every share, every comment helps these stories reach new listeners. And if you really want to support the channel, you can check out my books Blood in Brooklyn and The Hunt for Dogman, as well as my merchandise. The links are below in the comments. So whether it's picking up a copy of one of my books or just spreading the word, your support helps me keep these tales coming. Now tonight's story takes us deep into the swamps of Lake Okeechobee, Florida. A place where something unnatural began growing in poisoned water. Something that shouldn't exist, but it does. So dim the lights. Listen close, and let's see what's crawling out of the swamps.
1974. Gladys Sanchez's alarm clock buzzed loudly at 5 a.m. She slapped the button and swung her feet onto the cool tile floor. Another humid Florida morning. She moved through her routine the same way she had for years. Shower, brush her teeth, wash her face. She dabbed a little makeup on her cheeks, pinned her hair into a tight bun, and slipped into one of her favorite floral print dresses. By 5:30, she was already in the kitchen. The small house smelled of fresh coffee and frying butter as eggs sizzled in the pan. Gladys poured herself a cup and called down the hallway. "Javier, breakfast!" From the guest room, she heard movement, mattress springs creaking, something thumping against the wall. Her nephew had always been a heavy sleeper. "Javi," she called again with a smile. Javier Sanchez was visiting from New York. She couldn't have been prouder of him. First college graduate in the family. Now a herpetologist at the Bronx Zoo. A scientist who studied reptiles and amphibians. A boy from the Bronx studying crocodiles and snakes. Her sister would have cried seeing that. He had come down to Florida to visit her, making sure she was adjusting after leaving New York for the quiet life near the marsh. She plated the eggs and toast. Just then, she remembered something. "The newspaper," she muttered. "It should be on the porch." Gladys stepped outside into the warm dawn air. The sky was still gray, the swamp mist drifting slowly between the trees. She picked up the paper and glanced at the headline. "Teens found mutilated in swamp." Her brow furrowed. Dios mío. Just as she turned to go back inside, she heard it, a sound behind her. Wet, heavy breathing, slow, close. She began to turn, but before she could, a large clawed, webbed hand shot out of the mist and grabbed her by the head. Gladys screamed. The creature jerked her backward and slammed her to the porch. Its body was massive, scaly, reptilian. Its jaws opened wide, rows of jagged teeth snapping down as it tore into her neck and torso, nearly splitting her apart. Her screams echoed through the quiet morning. Inside the house, a chair scraped violently. "TIA!" Javier burst through the door and froze. His aunt was on the ground, the creature hunched over her, ripping flesh from bone with savage chomps. Its growls and snapping jaws drowned out her dying screams. Blood sprayed across the porch boards. The thing lifted its head. For a brief second, Javier saw its face. Frog-like, and scales like a gator, but amphibious. Eyes like black, dark voids. Then the creature grabbed what remained of Gladys and dragged her off the lawn into the woods. Her fading screams echoed through the swamp as the monster disappeared into the trees. Javier collapsed onto the porch steps, shaking, unable to breathe. The newspaper lay beside him. The headline stared up at him again. "Teens found mutilated in swamp." Javier managed to stand, then called the police. His hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the phone. It didn't take long for the sirens to arrive. Red and blue lights washed over the small house as a patrol car rolled into the dirt driveway. Out stepped Okeechobee County Sheriff Omar Fields, followed by 2 deputies. The 3 men walked toward the yard, then they stopped. The lawn was soaked in blood. A dark stain spread across the grass, thick and wide like someone had spilled buckets of it. But there was almost nothing else left. Only a few scattered pieces of torn fabric from Gladys's floral dress, and signs of something violent, something powerful. Sheriff Fields removed his hat slowly, his jaw tightening. One of the deputies turned away and swallowed hard. Javier stood near the porch steps, pale and hollow-eyed. Sheriff Fields walked over to him carefully. "You the one who called this in?" Javier nodded. His voice came out rough. "It took her." Sheriff Fields glanced at the lawn again. "Took her where?" Javier raised a trembling hand and pointed across the yard. The deputies followed his finger. Pressed deep into the wet ground were massive webbed footprints, each one nearly the size of a dinner plate. They crossed the yard, through the blood, and disappeared into the trees that lined the edge of the swamp. One of the deputies muttered under his breath, "Dear God." Sheriff Fields crouched beside one of the tracks, studying it. Then he looked back up at Javier. "You're telling me whatever did this made those?" Javier nodded slowly. "It's probably gone back into the water." The sheriff stood. "And how exactly are you so sure about that?" Javier pointed toward the swamp. "Because that's its home." Sheriff Fields narrowed his eyes. "And how do you know that?" Javier took a breath, trying to steady himself. "I work at the Bronx Zoo, reptile and amphibian exhibit." The deputies exchanged uneasy looks. Javier continued. "The thing I saw looked like some kind of mutation, part alligator, part frog." He pointed toward the dark marsh beyond the trees. "Both species live in or near water." The wind shifted across the reeds. "The swamp," Javier said quietly, "is where it belongs." Sheriff Fields looked out toward the tree line, then down at the massive tracks in the mud. Finally, he placed his hat back on his head. "Well," he muttered, "I guess that means we're heading Then the swamp exploded with sound. A deep, thunderous roar ripped through the trees. It wasn't a croak. It wasn't a growl. It was something ancient and wrong, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the air itself. Birds burst from the trees all around them, scattering into the sky in a frantic storm of wings. Sheriff Fields froze. His throat tightened as he swallowed hard. The deputies instantly raised their guns, scanning the tree line. For a moment, nothing moved. Only the slow ripple of swamp water and the distant flap of frightened birds. Then the light shifted. A massive shadow rolled across the clearing, sliding over the trees like something enormous had just stepped into the moonlight. The deputies stiffened. One of them whispered under his breath, "Sheriff, you see that?" Sheriff Fields nodded slowly. He saw it. They all did. A shape, huge, low and hunched, moving between the cypress trees. For a brief second, the creature stepped into the clearing. 10 feet tall, thick shoulders, a massive head turning slowly toward them. Then just as suddenly, it turned away. The shadow slipped back into the tree and disappeared into the swamp. The clearing fell silent again. Sheriff Fields lowered his gun slightly. "Sweet Jesus," one of the deputies muttered. "Is that what you saw?" Sheriff Omar Fields asked. Javier nodded slowly. He stood on the porch trembling, his arms wrapped around himself as if trying to hold his body together. His teeth chattered. His eyes were fixed on the tree line where the thing had disappeared. One of the deputies stepped forward, lifting his rifle. "Sheriff, I think I see the trail. I can go after it." "Negative." Omar's voice was calm, but firm. The deputy stopped mid-step. The sheriff stared into the forest. The woods had gone still. No birds, no insects. Just the uneasy silence that settles when something large and hungry is nearby. Omar slowly shook his head. "Son, that's too much monster for 3 deputies and a shotgun." The deputy lowered his weapon. "Then what do we do?" Sheriff Omar turned away from the trees and looked back at the house. "First thing, tape off this entire property. Nobody goes into those woods." His eyes moved to Javier. The young herpetologist was still shaking, barely able to stand. "And get him in the cruiser." The deputy frowned. "Sir?" "For his protection." Omar glanced back toward the trees again. "And ours." Just then, crack! A branch snapped deep in the forest. Every deputy raised their weapon. They waited. Nothing moved. No sound. No shadow. Just the wind brushing through the cypress. Sheriff Omar finally lowered his hand. "Let's move." They started back toward the patrol cars, but none of them noticed the dark shape standing between 2 trees. Large black eyes unblinking, its breath huffed as if it were disappointed. Sheriff Omar Fields climbed into the driver's seat of his cruiser. The red and blue lights washed over the trees, turning the swamp into a flickering nightmare of shadows. Deputy Collins slid into the passenger seat while another cruiser pulled in behind them. In the back seat, Javier sat hunched forward, his hands still shaking. Omar glanced once more toward the dark tree line. For a moment, he thought he saw something move between the trunks. Then it was gone. He put the cruiser in gear. "Let's move," he said into the radio mic. The patrol cars rolled slowly down the dirt road, tires crunching over gravel. The yellow tape fluttered behind them as they pulled away from the house. Once they reached the county road, Omar grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Fields." Static crackled. "Go ahead, Sheriff." Omar exhaled slowly. "Dispatch, I need you to notify the governor's emergency office." There was a pause. "Sheriff, what exactly should we tell them?" Omar looked through the windshield at the long stretch of dark road ahead. Then he spoke. "Tell them Okeechobee County has a large predatory animal loose in the swamp." Another pause. "How large, Sheriff?" Omar thought about the blood on the grass, the webbed footprints, the way the woods had gone silent. "Large enough," he said quietly, "that I'm requesting National Guard support immediately." The radio crackled again. "Copy that. Request for National Guard assistance." Omar slowly hung the mic back on the dash. In the back seat, Javier spoke in a shaky voice. "Sheriff, what if they don't believe you?" Omar sighed, then replied, "Then we are fucked." The cruisers pulled up to the Okeechobee Sheriff's Department. Then he stepped out and opened the back door. "Let's go." Javier climbed out slowly. He wasn't handcuffed, but the sheriff's grip on his arm told him very clearly he wasn't free either. They walked inside the station. The deputies avoided eye contact. Everyone had heard the radio traffic. Sheriff Omar led Javier down a narrow hallway and pushed open the door to the interrogation room. A metal table, 2 chairs, a buzzing fluorescent light. "Sit." Javier sat down. Omar pulled the chair out across from him and leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "You're not covered in blood," Omar said calmly. "So you're not a suspect in your aunt's murder." Javier swallowed hard. Sheriff Omar's voice softened for a moment. "You have my condolences. Gladys was good people." He gave a faint smile. "She used to bring empanadas to the station every Christmas." The smile faded. His face hardened. "We have a problem." Javier leaned forward immediately. "Yeah, you do." His voice cracked with anger and fear. "And I wish you the best with that, Sheriff. But if I'm not a suspect, I'm getting out of here." Sheriff Omar smirked. "You could." He leaned back in the chair. But right now, you're an eyewitness to an active homicide investigation. His eyes locked onto Javier's. And I don't need you running around town telling folks about whatever the hell that thing was. The room went quiet. Then Omar changed his tone. Persuasive, controlled, the kind of voice a man uses when the offer comes with conditions. Now, he folded his hands. I understand you're some kind of lizard specialist. Herpetologist, Javier corrected. Right, Omar said. Well, maybe you could offer your assistance. Javier stared at him. And what if I don't? Sheriff Omar didn't blink. Well, he leaned forward again. I cite you for obstruction of an ongoing investigation. His voice dropped lower. And you sit in one of my holding cells for the next 30 days while I sort this mess out. Silence filled the room. Javier studied him carefully. You're blackmailing me. Sheriff Omar shrugged slightly. I'm motivating you. He stood up and walked to the small window in the door. Outside, deputies moved quickly through the station. Phones ringing, radios squawking. The sheriff turned back slowly. You saw what that thing did to your aunt. His voice was quiet now. That creature is still out there. He leaned on the table again. And right now, you're the only man in this county who might understand it. Javier's hands slowly clenched. Finally, he asked the question he'd been trying to avoid. What exactly do you want me to do? Sheriff Omar gave a grim smile. Help me figure out what the hell we're hunting. Javier slowly looked down at his watch. 6:57 a.m. Only minutes until 7. Outside the small window of the station, the Florida sun was already climbing, the early morning heat beginning to press against the building. Even at this hour, the temperature had to be close to 70 degrees and rising. Javier's mind raced. If that thing was amphibious, if it behaved anything like the reptiles and amphibians he studied, it wouldn't stay exposed once the sun got high. It would retreat, back to water, back to mud, back to whatever den it used to hide from the heat, just like most amphibians, which meant it was probably already gone, already back in the swamp, already waiting. Then the memory slammed into him. His aunt, her scream, the wet tearing sound, the blood on the lawn. Javier's hands began shaking uncontrollably. He looked up at the sheriff. No, he said, his voice breaking. I can't. This is crazy. Sheriff Omar stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood up slowly. Well, he said calmly, I don't make promises I don't keep. Javier's stomach dropped. Omar walked to the door and opened it. Deputy. One of the deputies stepped in. Take Mr. Sanchez to holding. Javier jumped to his feet. Sheriff, come on. Omar grabbed his arm firmly and guided him down the hallway. They stopped at a row of steel-barred cells. The deputy unlocked one. Omar looked directly into Javier's eyes. You can sit in there and think about it. He nodded toward the bench inside. Because whether you like it or not, he lowered his voice. That thing that killed your aunt is still out there. The sheriff stepped back. The cell door slammed shut with a heavy clang. The lock clicked. Javier sat down slowly on the bench. Through the bars, he could see deputies rushing around the station. Something was happening. Something big. Javier sat on the hard bench inside the holding cell. Hours passed, but the horror he had witnessed refused to leave him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw it again. His Aunt Gladys. The woman who had practically raised him. The woman who made sure he always had food in the refrigerator and money in his pocket when he left for college. Dead. Gone. Eaten by a creature nature had no right to create. The first hour, he cried. Quietly at first, then harder. By the third hour, the tears were gone, replaced by a hollow silence inside him. That's when he heard them. Boots. Multiple men entering the sheriff's station. Loud voices. 6 of them by the sound of it. The state tactical squad. They talked big, bragging, joking. Men who believed they were walking into just another hunt and be back for a 6-pack by tomorrow evening. Javier stared at the floor. They had no idea what they were up against. Neither did he. Then footsteps stopped outside the cell, announcing, "The sheriff appeared." Sheriff Omar Fields stood there quietly for a moment before unlocking the door. The metal clanked open. "Look, kid," he said. "I've been doing some checking on you." Javier didn't respond. Omar leaned against the bars. "You graduated top of your class." He held up a file. "Majored in biology and microbiology. You have a PhD in veterinary medicine, particularly in reptile and amphibian cross species." The sheriff shook his head slightly. "If I didn't know better, I swear you mixed that thing up yourself. But you weren't here when this thing started killing. Look, Javier, I've got some strange beast roaming my swamp." His voice grew sterner. "It already killed your aunt. And a couple of kids." Javier slowly lifted his head. Omar continued. "And from the reports I've been digging up, this thing has been killing people in those swamps for over a decade." Javier straightened. The gears in his mind began turning. His breathing slowed. His scientist brain began to push through the trauma. Sheriff Omar watched him carefully. "I'm not asking for myself." His voice softened. "I'm not even asking for your aunt." He pointed toward the front of the station where the tactical team was gathering gear. "But I'm asking you to help me prevent more killings." He leaned forward slightly. "Those guys in there, they don't have a clue what that thing can do, am I right? Please, Javier, help me." Javier rubbed his face and exhaled slowly. Then he looked down at his watch. 4 p.m. He nodded slightly. "First thing you need to do. Tell the town not to come outside after sunset." Sheriff Omar listened carefully. No pets. No livestock. No kids playing outside. Nothing. Javier's eyes locked with a cold precision. "It hunts at night." Sheriff Omar straightened and nodded. "Groovy." Javier blinked. "Groovy?" Omar shrugged. "It's 1974. Then he turned toward the squad room. "All right, boys," he called out. "Looks like we got ourselves a monster hunt." Javier stood slowly. The sheriff pulled the cell door open and led him down a hallway towards an open room. The noise inside spilled out. Laughter, chopsticks scraping cardboard cartons, the smell of cheap Chinese food and cigarette smoke. 6 men sat around a scarred wooden table. Crew cuts, olive green uniforms, combat boots. Rifles leaned against the wall behind them like they were just another piece of furniture. They looked relaxed, too relaxed. One of them had a map of the swamp spread out on the table while the others talked over each other. "We run a sweep line from the levee. Yeah, flush it out of the brush. Whatever it is, 6 rifles will take care of it." The sheriff stepped inside. "Gentlemen," the talking slowed. "This is Dr. Javier Sanchez. He's a reptile specialist from the Bronx Zoo. I brought him in to help us." A couple of the men nodded politely. One of them barely looked up from his fried rice. Javier stood quietly and opened the folder the sheriff placed in front of him. Photographs. The first one made his chest tighten. His aunt's porch. Blood across the wooden boards. He closed the folder. One of the soldiers noticed. "Something wrong, Professor." Javier looked around the table. 6 confident faces. Men who believed they had seen it all, and firepower was the answer to everything. He spoke quietly. "I saw it." That got their attention because the room went still. One of them leaned forward. "You saw the beast." Javier nodded once. "It killed my aunt." No one spoke. The sheriff shifted behind him, but stayed silent. Javier continued. "I was less than 15 maybe. 12 feet away. One of the soldiers set his chopsticks down slowly. And Javier exhaled. It's about 10 feet tall. The men glanced at each other, and it weighs close to 1,000 pounds. He pointed to the map on the table. And it's not just some animal wandering the swamp, Javier continued. It behaves like an amphibious predator. The man standing near with the map frowned. What does that mean? It means it lives near water. Javier pointed to the swamp map. Amphibious predators regulate their body temperature by staying close to water. During the heat of the day, they retreat somewhere cool and dry. Since there have been no more reports or sightings. Since it killed my aunt this morning, I say it's someplace waiting for sunset. Another soldier leaned in. So you're saying it has a nest? Not a nest. Javier shook his head. A den. His finger traced along the waterways. Somewhere hidden, somewhere shaded, probably near flowing water or drainage. He looked up. A culvert, a drainage tunnel, maybe a hollow under an old bridge. The men exchanged looks. Now they were listening. Javier turned a few pages in the folder. I've been looking at the attacks. Photos slid across the table. Teenagers, hunters, fishermen, all within miles of each other. His finger tapped the map. There's a pattern here. The room leaned closer. I'm not completely sure yet, he admitted. But most of the attacks happen within a 3-mile radius of this section of swamp. He circled an area with a pencil. If we're going to find it, this is where we start. One of the soldiers studied the map. You're saying that's where it lives? Javier nodded slowly. It won't travel far from its den. The room was silent now. One of the men looked up at Javier. You sound awful certain for a guy who says he's not sure. Javier stood confidently, folding his arms. That's what science is, he said calmly. Proving the unknown and testing theory. The soldiers were quiet now. The earlier jokes about aliens and swamp monsters were gone. Javier glanced at his watch. Sunset is in a few hours, he said. If I were you, I'd start looking. One of the soldiers frowned. You're not coming with us. Javier shook his head immediately. No. Another soldier leaned forward. Look, Professor, you saw this thing. You understand how it thinks. Javier didn't respond. We're not asking you to go into the swamp, the man continued. Just ride with us. Give us your input. You don't even have to leave the truck. The room waited. Javier rubbed his face slowly. The image of his aunt's porch flashed through his mind again. Blood on the boards, the sound of tearing. He sighed. All right. The RMMV tactical truck rumbled down the dirt road, its suspension groaning over potholes and roots. Javier sat in the passenger seat, arms folded, staring out through the windshield. The swamp stretched out on both sides of the road. Black water, tangled mangroves, Spanish moss hanging like curtains in the fading light. The sun was sinking fast. Behind them, 2 more trucks followed, headlights bouncing through the trees. No one inside the vehicle talked much. The soldiers checked their rifles, metal clicks, magazines sliding into place. Javier's eyes kept moving across the landscape, studying, searching. Then he saw it, his aunt's house. The small wooden place sat alone near the tree line, porch light still hanging crooked where the deputies had left it. For a moment, his chest tightened. He turned his head away. The truck rolled past. Up ahead, the road opened into a muddy clearing at the edge of the swamp. The vehicles came to a stop. Doors opened. Boots hit dirt. Sheriff Omar stepped out of his cruiser and looked at the men gathering their gear. The sky above them was turning purple. Night was coming fast. Lock and load, fellas, the sheriff called out. Rifles snapped into ready positions. The sheriff pointed toward the swamp. We work in 2 teams. He pointed to the left. Deputy Clark is in charge of Blue Team. You take that sector." Then he pointed deeper into the darker section of marshland. "Deputy Wainwright and Red Team moves this way." The men nodded, spreading out and checking radios. Javier stayed in the truck, while Sheriff Omar stood outside looking at the map with his flashlight. The engine idled softly beneath him. From where Javier sat, he could see the dark swamp stretching out into the distance, the night sky slowly swallowing the last of the daylight. Frogs were beginning to croak. Insects buzzed in the thick air. Something about the stillness felt wrong. Javier stared out toward the waterline, watching. The soldiers moved into the swamp in two lines, flashlights and rifles cutting thin beams through the growing darkness. Javier's eyes drifted toward the trees, then toward the culverts along the drainage ditch, then toward the water. His mind kept replaying what he had seen that morning. He whispered under his breath as his eyes scanned the darkness again. "Where's your den?" The swamp had gone nearly still and black. The soldiers had disappeared into the reeds and mangroves with their flashlights, thin beams cutting through the darkness. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then the sheriff's radio crackled, static. Omar, you copy." The sheriff grabbed the handset. "Sheriff Omar here." The dispatch voice burst through the speaker. "I got Veronica Chambers on the line. She needs to speak to you. Says it's urgent." "Send it," Omar replied. A panicked and shaking voice cracked through. "This is Veronica Chambers. Something attacked our dog." Javier's head snapped toward the radio. "What happened?" Omar asked. "My daughter and I were walking King, our German Shepherd, a big one, 120 pounds. The woman's voice broke. And then, oh God. "What did you see, ma'am?" Omar pressed. "There was this tongue." The room inside the truck went still. A giant frog tongue shot out of the woods and wrapped around him. The radio filled with sobbing. It just pulled him into the trees, like he weighed nothing. Javier felt the blood drain from his face. "Did you see the animal?" Omar asked. "We saw it moving," the woman cried. "It chased us all the way back to our house before it went back into the swamp." Javier jumped out of the truck and leaned forward suddenly. "Sheriff," Omar covered the radio. "What?" "Where's their house?" The sheriff reached for the map spread across the hood and pointed to a spot just a mile down the road. "Right here." Javier stared at it, then his eyes widened. "No." He leaned closer. "That's not random." The sheriff frowned. "What do you mean?" Javier tapped the map hard. "It's the den." Omar blinked. "What?" Javier pointed toward the dark silhouette of the bridge spanning the drainage channel nearby. "It's under that bridge." The sheriff looked out through the windshield. The bridge sat about 200 yards away, an old concrete structure with drainage culverts running beneath it into the swamp. Javier's voice turned urgent. "Call them back, Sheriff." Omar grabbed the radio again. "Veronica, listen to me carefully." Javier was already opening the truck door. "We need to get over there now." Omar turned to shout to the deputies. Then the night exploded. A scream ripped through the swamp. A man's scream. Gunfire erupted seconds later. Rifles cracked violently through the darkness. 3 shots, then 5 more. Another scream. "Shoot it! Shoot it!" someone shouted over the radio. Something massive crashed through the trees. Then more gunfire. Flashlights whipped wildly through the swamp as the soldiers fired into the darkness. Then came a sound that froze the blood in Javier's veins. A deep roar, like thunder and primal rage combined. Javier grabbed the truck door and stared toward the swamp. Muzzle flashes flickered between the trees. The sheriff shouted into the radio. "Red team report. Blue team report." Another rifle cracked through the swamp. Then came a scream, not a shout, not a warning, a scream of pure terror. "Oh God, it's got The radio transmission exploded into static. For a split second, the swamp went silent again. Then branches crashed somewhere in the darkness. A deputy burst out of the tree line, running blindly toward the drainage channel. His flashlight bounced wildly in his hand as he stumbled through the mud. "Help me!" He dove toward the water. But he never made it. Something shot out of the darkness. A thick, glistening tongue, longer than a man, whipped from the shadows. At its end, a jagged mandible snapped shut around the deputy's neck with a wet crack. The man's scream cut off instantly. The tongue recoiled like a harpoon line, dragging him backward. "Jesus Christ!" Sheriff Omar shouted. He swung his flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the hanging moss and froze. There it was, the gator frog beast, 10 feet tall, 1,000 pounds of muscle and scaled hide, rising out of the black swamp water. Its massive clawed hands held Deputy Wainwright like a rag doll. The creature's black eyes reflected the flashlight beam. Its jaws opened wide enough to swallow a man whole. And in the sick white circle of Omar's light, Wainwright's body tore apart in the monster's grip. Omar fired. The rifle blast echoed across the swamp. The creature jerked its head toward him. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then the gator frog threw its head back and released a deafening roar. The sound rolled through the trees like thunder. Before Omar could fire again, the monster dropped backward into the water, gone. Only ripples spread across the black surface. Omar stood frozen for half a second. Then he turned. "Get in the truck!" he shouted to Javier. Both men ran. They dove into the truck just as something massive slammed into the side of it. The impact sounded like a freight train hitting steel. The truck lifted off its wheels and rolled. Metal twisted and creaked. Glass shattered. The vehicle crashed onto its side in the mud as the swamp went dark again. Sheriff Omar kicked at the cracked windshield until the glass finally burst outward with a sharp crunch. Shards rained into the mud as he dragged himself through the opening and dropped hard into the shallow swamp water beside the overturned truck. He pushed himself upright, breathing hard, then reached back toward the cab. "Come on, Javier," he hissed urgently. Inside the tilted cab, Javier was struggling against the steering wheel and twisted doorframe. Omar grabbed his arm and hauled him upward toward the broken windshield. Javier slid out and dropped beside him in the mud. For a moment, both men just stood there, catching their breath in the eerie silence of the swamp. Then, behind Omar came a long, wet hiss, like a giant serpent drawing breath. Omar's eyes widened. Slowly, he turned his head. Javier followed his gaze. "What the?" A massive webbed claw shot out of the darkness and snatched Omar off the ground. The sheriff screamed as the claws slammed into his torso, piercing through his shirt and digging deep into muscle. The grip tightened with a sickening crack as bone began to give under the pressure. "Run!" Omar shouted. The creature lifted him easily, like he weighed nothing. Rows of jagged teeth gleamed in the pale moonlight. Omar fired his revolver blindly. 2 deafening shots cracked through the swamp. The beast didn't even slow. It pulled him closer. Then its jaws clamped down. A wet, crushing chomp echoed through the trees. Omar screamed. The sound tore through the swamp as the creature bit again. Crunch! Bone snapped. The beast shook its head violently. Omar's screams became ragged, choking cries. Javier staggered backward in horror. The sounds of tearing flesh and crushing bone followed him. Omar's scream faded into a broken gurgle. Javier gasped. The beast gave a deep, rumbling growl as it turned towards him. Javier turned and ran. He sprinted down the muddy road, away from the wrecked truck, his boots hammering the dirt hard enough to jar his bones. Behind him came the sound of the creature's pursuit. Heavy, wet, deliberate. Each lumbering footfall slapped through the darkness like something too big, too wrong, and far too close. Javier didn't dare look back. He just ran. Then pain exploded across the back of his right calf. It hit so fast and so hard that his leg folded beneath him. He crashed into the dirt, skidding through mud and gravel with a ragged cry. Twisting onto his side, he caught a glimpse of it just before panic swallowed the moment whole. The gator frog's tongue was sliding back into its mouth. It had struck him, and it was already coming again. Javier rolled just as the next lash snapped into the ground where his body had been, splattering mud across his face. He scrambled upright, nearly falling again as his wounded leg buckled under him. White-hot pain tore through his calf, and now every step came uneven, desperate, broken by a limp he couldn't control. Warm blood trickled down into his sock from the open gash, but he still ran. Because behind him, the thing in the swamp was not slowing down, and Javier knew with sick certainty that if he fell again, he would not get back up. Through the pain and the adrenaline clawing through his veins, Javier staggered up the final stretch and lunged onto his aunt's porch. Each step felt like his leg might give out for good. He fumbled through his pockets, fingers clumsy, slick with sweat and blood. The key, where was it? Behind him, the swamp thundered closer. He found it. A small cold piece of metal that suddenly felt like the only thing keeping him alive. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Once, twice. The footsteps hit the edge of the driveway. Closer, closer. Come on, come on! He jammed the key into the lock, missed, cursed under his breath, then forced it in again. This time it caught. A twist. The knob turned. The door flew open. Javier stumbled inside, collapsing hard onto the floor as the door slammed behind him. And then it came. A roar. The gator frog eased up the driveway like something that had all the time in the world, like it already owned the place. Javier tried to stand. The moment he put weight on his leg, pain detonated up his body. His calf had swollen grotesquely, the skin tight, angry, veins darkening beneath the surface, like something was spreading inside him, not just a wound, a poison. His breath hitched as the realization sank in. It tagged me. He dropped back down, dragging himself across the hardwood, leaving a smeared trail behind him. Each pull forward felt slower than the last, like the toxin was turning his muscles into wet sand. Behind him, crack. The front door didn't open. It exploded inward. Wood splintered. Hinges screamed. The entire frame tore loose as the gator frog forced its way inside, its massive shape blotting out the daylight behind it. For a moment, it just stood there, watching. Those black, lidless eyes locked onto him with a cold animal certainty. Not rage, not hunger, ownership. Javier's fingers clawed at the floor, trying to pull himself faster, but his arms trembled now, weakening. The creature stepped in, one heavy, wet, deliberate step at a time. Its claws clicked softly against the floor. Its long, slick tongue flicked between rows of serrated teeth, tasting the air, tasting him, closing the distance, cutting off everything. Javier's back hit the base of the couch. Nowhere left to go. His chest heaved as panic finally broke through whatever adrenaline he had left. No, 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 no! The gator frog lowered its head slightly, almost curious. Then its jaws began to open, wider and wider, too wide. The skin along its mouth stretched unnaturally, splitting at the corners as rows of jagged teeth revealed themselves in layers, like something built to make sure nothing ever escaped once it bit down. A low, guttural sound rumbled from deep in its chest. Javier screamed, and the creature lunged. If you're ever down in Florida, skirting the edges of Lake Okeechobee, the air starts to change before the stories do, like the swamp is holding its breath. Ask the older locals, real locals, the kind who don't laugh things off, and they'll tell you about a place that used to be there, a town, small, quiet, forgettable in the way most places are, until they're not. Now, you won't find it on any map. What you will find, if you go far enough off the main road, is a perimeter. High fencing, steel posts sunk deep into the mud, barbed wire curling at the top like thorns on something that doesn't want to be touched, and running through it all, a constant electric hum, and a bunch of warning signs telling you to keep away. There are barricades too, old ones, reinforced ones. Some look government issued. Others look like they were thrown up in a hurry by people who didn't have time to think. No one's welcome there. No excuses, explanations, just silence. And that fence. Visitors sometimes joke they are set on keeping people out. That's when the locals stop smiling, because everyone knows better. That fence isn't there to keep you out. It's there to keep something in, something that didn't die when the town did, something that learned the layout, the smells, the rhythm of human life before everything went quiet. And on certain nights, when the wind drags low across the water, when the frogs stop singing all at once, when the dark feels just a little too close, some swear you can still hear it, moving, testing, waiting.
If that story pulled you in, if you felt the water rise, heard something moving just beneath the surface, then you've just stepped into the world of obsidian quill nightmares. Thank you for watching. Seriously, every view, every minute you spend here keeps these stories alive and getting darker. If you enjoyed the story, go ahead and like, subscribe, and drop a comment. I want to hear what you think and what you believe is really out there. And don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss the next nightmare creeping out of the shadows. Because around here, the stories don't end when the video does. They just wait for the next time you close your eyes.